Last week I preached a sermon that dealt with the concept of core values. It seemed to have a tremendous impact on a number of you because I've had several conversations during the course of this past week about that sermon. I don't want to re-preach the sermon, not that I could, because quite frankly it's already grown tremendously within me, but we had picked up on H. Richard Niebuhr's, the famous theologian and philosopher's concept of religion being the core value through which everything else is evaluated. That deep down inside each one of us is a hard core of commitment to something which shadows, interprets, colors, filters, however you want to put it, every other aspect of our lives. And that each one of us has such a core value, regardless of what we call it. It may be a commitment to a business ethic, an economic system, a commitment to a political party, to a boss, to any one of a number of things. And however we have little subcores around the basic core ethic that we try to pawn off as being what we really believe, our actions come through speaking so loudly that the core ethic is visible to all. That's a powerful statement, I think, and it's an interesting statement. One of the things I said in the newsletter, as you will know, and I was reworking this a little bit all the way along, is that oftentimes when we look at the world, we think that we have essentially good people who for one instant have gone wrong, and I'm not so sure we don't have to begin to look, as I rather strongly said in the newsletter this time, at the fact that there are an awful lot of pagans in the world who need conversion. That the real core ethic is not what they appear to do on occasion, but the way they live their lives. And that there are people in the pulpit, there are people in the pews, there are people in the social agencies who have essentially a core ethic which has nothing to do with Christianity, but they try to assuage the guilt by stepping out into that area. What is your core ethic was the challenge of the sermon. What is it that makes you tick and decide? What is it that gives you the coloring to all that you interpret? What is it that says to you when you meet somebody you don't like, somebody that has done something to you, when you are faced with a situation which is next to impossible, what is it that says to you, I will stand strong and please God, or please boss, or please husband, or please wife, or please self, or whatever? That's your core. And the challenge that we have been talking about last week, and we're going to move on beyond a little bit this week, is how do you not only establish that core ethic, but change it. As so often happens, this is a request sermon, and the people who requested it aren't here. Doesn't matter. Those of you who are here, it's a special request sermon for each of you. When I put the sign up last week that changing values at 40, I didn't have room to put age 40, and then I started to chuckle, because everybody coming away from that light really is hitting it by the time they get there, and I hope some driver said, oh, and realized how fast they were going. Changing values has two concepts. One of them is that the values are automatically changing. The other one is that you are taking the opportunity to change the values. As a matter of fact, they are not different in this particular case. The question is not whether at age 40 or age 39 or age 41 or 60 or 20 or wherever, whether or not your values are going to change. The question is, will you have some control over those changing values? And the primary function of today's pulling together is to take a look at how that might happen and how we might begin to modify. It is not a new question. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Jesus answered him, saying, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born anew, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? Jesus answered, Truly, truly, I say unto you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. For those of you who are record keepers, I understand that during the past summer, Ed Willingham pointed out that every sermon has 3 points. For the first time in history, I have 4. You can count them. First point is that there are a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists today who argue that the patterns of living are learned by the time a child is 4 or 5, and certainly not beyond that, and possibly even earlier. Point number 1 will not take an awful lot of time because I think it's something which is open to debate, but it does say something to us in terms of our Christianity. One of the things that we have traditionally done in every church that I've been a member of is considered any Christian education before the age of 5 in kindergarten basically to provide a place for the parents to leave their children while they're in the worship service. We have never creatively, in any church that I am aware of, utilized the crib to kindergarten as a training, teaching time to instill in our young people Christian values. If it is true, a big if it is true that our patterns are essentially learned and we don't change them for the rest of our lives, then we have an obligation beyond anything we have ever realized to step in at that crucial age and develop programming and ideas that are not only consistent with the growth and development of the child in the physical and the mental, but challenge the spiritual. I have not read the book called Passages. But I understand Passages is a book which is beginning to understand that in each of our lives there are continuing crises. More and more research is being done into the lives of ministers, since I happen to be more familiar with that research. What happens in their lives and how they suddenly get a goal and they go off and they do their seminary training, they come out and they begin to build in a small church and they begin to work and they grow up into a larger church and they develop certain skills and then they begin to lose their idealism because much of what church life is about has nothing to do with what they learned in seminary. And every minister I've ever talked to said, I wish they had taught me mimeographing 101 instead of Hebrew. Corporate financing and fundraising 208 instead of Greek. Business management 309 instead of preaching. Where over and over again, the things which a man is trained for in the ministry are the things which oftentimes he is not using. And then comes what is known in many, many circles as the midlife crisis. A minister has been in the field for 15 years or 12 years, close to 20 years, and he suddenly says, God, what am I doing? There's not only ministers, everybody sitting in this room who has passed his 40th birthday, which is why I chose the age 40, has gone through the same midlife crisis. There's not a man that I have ever met who thinks about his existence who doesn't at some time, particularly near the age of 40, say to himself, do I want to do this for another 20 years? Do I want to maintain the same schedule I'm doing now for another 20 years? Haven't I fulfilled the commitments I made as a young man? Haven't I fulfilled the commitments even to God, the ministers say, when I came into the ministry to serve Him? And haven't I served Him loyally these many years? And isn't there something beyond where I am now? Am I right, fellows? Don't you, about that age, and I'm not talking about a specific age because it happens again on a couple of other stages along, but don't you suddenly feel with family and pressures and the world pressing down upon you that you're in a mold and you're all kinds of fears and things that begin to hold you there? You're usually in a financial position where it's difficult to take a risk because you've got family commitments, you've got kids facing college, you've got house payments, you've got a way of life, you've got certain comforts, and the pressures build down, and you say to yourself, do I have to do this for another 20 years? Because if I do, I will die. talking to the fellows only because women go through it too. And sometimes they have less options, and it's more tragic. They feel the same kinds of pressures. They not only get the pressures from their husbands or friends who are going through this, but they have the pressures within themselves. And how many women say, as much as I love it, day in and day out, up at 7 o'clock, fix the breakfast, make the bed, do this, off shopping, back for lunch, get ready for dinner, fix dinner, do things, pat my husband on the back so he feels good, watch him lay down on the couch, do the ironing, get ready for bed, 7 o'clock, up for breakfast, and on and on and on, and the pressures begin to build. Now I'm going to tell you. I wasn't going to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you. I spent 2 months going through this summer. There were a number of things that brought me back. One of them was my family. It would have been very easy for me to call Dolores and say, Dolores, I love you and I know you understand. Tell him you don't know what's happened, but I'll be back when I get back because I'm not ready. I almost did it. Because I was going through a lot of self-examination, having been involved in churches for 25 years as a pastor of one kind or another, having been through the upheavals, facing a lot of things in my own existence, and I asked myself, in a very special way, can I take another year of any church? And that is a very difficult question to answer. Now, what do you do when you go through this kind of a thing? I think each one of us, regardless of whether we be male or female or at whatever age of our life, that particular crisis, there's a teenage crisis, there's a 20 to 30 crisis, there's a 30 to 40 crisis, there's a 40 to 50, 50 to 60, there's a 70-year-old crisis, there's an 80-year-old crisis, there's a 90-year-old crisis. And I imagine that the individual, that gentleman who was born in 1840 and just died yesterday at the age of 139, faced a crisis unlike any of the rest of us will ever face, but he must have had a 140-year-old crisis. What do you do when you're in these periodic periods of re-examination, which are not only essential to growth, but painfully essential? I think the first thing you do is look at your talents. Most of us are tremendously able at looking at our faults. We never look at our talents and our good points. I ask my son, and I continually, I think, pour into him. I appreciate this. You did a nice job on this one. You worked well on this one. I asked him one time why he's always talking about how bad he is, never how good he is. He said, oh, it's no good to talk about how good you are. That's bragging. Nonsense. You ought to be looking at your talents. It's that particular set of things that is unique to you in terms of talents that keep you going. You ought to be taking a look at your goals, not the immediate impact of what's happening to you, but what direction are you intending to go? Where do you want to be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now? Not set in some hard, rigid way, not set in something over which you have really no control, but what is it you want to be doing with your life as the best informed source of your direction? What are your goals and your talents? What are your likes and what are your dislikes? Every job that I have ever seen anybody in has certain things that are bad. The most exciting job in the world has certain liabilities built into it, particularly things that go on and on and on. I love to travel, but if I was traveling all the time, I'd go stark raving mad. I get very sick of hotels. I hate restaurant food for the most part. I get tired, particularly if I'm traveling alone, of sitting in hotel rooms, reading, and having nobody to really talk and share with. And as much as I like in certain kinds of contexts and other kinds I don't, and I have to continually re-examine what my likes and dislikes are. What are my frustrations? Are they real frustrations or are they within me? Are they unholy expectations or are they real expectations? Most of us are frustrated not because something doesn't happen, but because it doesn't happen the way we thought it was going to happen. We build into our systems of thinking about ourselves and each other's preconceived ideas of what it's going to be, and then we're frustrated. Kids go through this. They're going to have a date. First date's always a disaster because it's built into all kinds of things, good and bad, and nobody ever had a date in the world that was exactly like they dreamed it was going to be. Jobs are that way. People the first couple of days on the job are always ready to quit. Either it's not challenging enough or it's too challenging. And over a period of time, what they learn is as they make the adjustments to the job that there's an opportunity for them to grow and to understand that they have an opportunity of fulfilling realistic likes and dislikes and frustrations and achievements. What are your failures? What are the difference between the failures and your incapabilities? A failure is something over which you have control and haven't done it well. An incapability is something over which you have no control and therefore ought not to be considered part of your strengths or even part of your major thrust. And there is a big difference between the two. What are your fears? What are your hopes? What are your needs? What are your responsibilities? What are your commitments? These are all things that an individual sitting and trying to understand goal setting for themselves need to consider. It's not only responsibilities for others who are responsible or in a relationship to us like children and family, but what are our commitments to those children and to that family and to that job and to that individual? And are there ways in which we can begin to move to take all of these things and put them into a better focus? For one of the major things about changing your value systems and your values at age 40 or any other age is to see that on some occasions it's a matter of breaking, and on other occasions it's a matter of adjusting. I came back. Because the more I reflected, I realized that much of the frustration that I was feeling was not a frustration of Pine Hill Congregational Church, but was a frustration of Jim Lyons. That many of the frustrations were expectations that were not legitimate for the church, nor for me. That many of the things that I wanted to do, you have given me the freedom to do it, I just wasn't doing it. I came back because I realized that essentially the situation was one which I enjoyed if I could make the adjustments within my life to creatively use my skills and energies, not only with Pine Hill, but in many growing ways. And I cannot help but feel, in the 5 or 6 weeks that I've been back, many of you are smiling and see exactly that difference. A little abrasive at times. You get the easy end of it. You want to see me when I'm up on my high tail. I got a letter that I'm sending out tomorrow that's going to blow the stock off some people. It's a strong letter. I'm going to read it to you. It's the Michigan Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights. Very good friend of mine. Dear Dick, having received your information about the Michigan Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights, I feel compelled to respond both quickly and earnestly. I must admit a feeling of frustration to find myself so completely opposed to the ideas of individuals for whom I have not only the profoundest respect but find allies in many of the areas common in our lives. Yet I am both shocked and dismayed by the total inability of the religious communities represented by your group to avoid religious bigotry. Quote, the issue is religious liberty, whether all of us will be coerced by legislation reflecting one particular religious ideology, while at the same time calling for legislative action in the name of religious organizations. Each of us has worked desperately to achieve certain goals through the legal process, civil rights, women's rights, and a host of other ethically sound and morally defensible positions. We have never argued that to decide for these items because they were sponsored by and included our religious commitment, quote, violated, unquote, the concept of the separation of church and state. To do so on this issue strikes me to be the most blatant form of discrimination and, quite frankly, below the ethical standards of those involved. Going to 30 ministers and rabbis. Even more, at my expense, not yours, so you won't have to bear responsibility. Even more, I have for a number of years tried to justify the concept of abortion in terms of a theological position. I must admit that each time I try, I'm driven more towards an anti-abortion stand. I can find no theological justifications for seeing a fetus of 2 weeks, for example, being separated from the fetus of 16 or 20 weeks in terms of human impact. Each time I view the incredible development of a child from the moment of conception, I find it increasingly difficult to believe that the fetus is not human and therefore of equal value to and worthy of all the efforts for civil rights I have stood for over the years. Dr. Hood's fine statement about the freedom of choice and the freedom of parenthood is true, but I question if the point of choice is after conception. I have argued for a long period that a family responsibility requires the involvement of all members of the family and not the decision of any one member over the others. I therefore find it difficult to understand that it is a, quote, right, unquote, of the woman, without consultation with others in the process, to make such a major decision. I am deeply concerned about the increasing use of abortion as a means of birth control. I do not believe that the greatest creative act on earth should be treated with such a laissez-faire attitude, particularly by those of the religious community who are in the foreground of responsible decision-making involving all parties. Yet this is not the time to argue the question nor to debate an opposing viewpoint. For your and my own edification, I would offer a simple challenge to each of you individually and or collectively. Setting aside all of the sociological jargon, I would that any of you present me with a sound theological position which permits under the impact of God such an unholy massacre of innocence. If I write so boldly, please be assured that it is because I share your sense of urgency, though I have been unable to believe or find a theological, ethical statement which supports your position. Here I stand, Dick, because I can do no other. That's the direct growth of 2 months in Jerusalem, which said that if I am to be loyal to you and to myself and to my God, I can no longer be what has been typically the liberal, standing by the sidelines and saying casually, it's up to them, whatever they want, it's up to them, they have their own viewpoint. But I have to begin to stand more and more forcefully, bringing the kind of impact in life that Pine Hill and I have explored for 9 years, and doing it lovingly but directly. Now, Nicodemus raised an interesting question. After you do all these kinds of things, what is the real thing that makes you want to do it? And there's this concept of repentance or conversion. Conversion is essentially repenting from the things in the past and moving into the future. It is often under the impact of a crisis. An individual will go through a heart attack. He is overweight, he is having all kinds of problems, and that physical crisis forces him to do something that he would not have done otherwise. I know a number of men that I have seen through heart attacks who have lost 50 pounds, 60 pounds, 70 pounds, because they knew that if they didn't, their existence was about over. There are mental crises and social crises and family crises that cause individuals to rethink what they're doing, what they're teaching, what they're acting. There are individuals who are constantly in the goals and in touch with each other in such a way that as they respond to each other, their very core existence begins to move. And to those of you who come to church are constantly being challenged in terms of your own ethical, moral, spiritual beings to read.